You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
For the third time in 4 years, Ole Miss is winning 10 regular season games, and that should put them into the college football playoff. That is Steven Willis, Locked On Ole Miss, joining me here on the show. We're breaking down this Ole Miss schedule because it's interesting. It's very Ole Miss-like, Steven, in that the first few weeks, not a lot of people are going to watch very many Ole Miss games because it's a Furman, Middle Tennessee, Wake, Georgia Southern. People will tune in for the Kentucky game. That's about it. But I am hard-pressed with the returners they have, the offseason that they have had. Lane Kiffin's still there. I'm hard-pressed to see Ole Miss doing anything but starting 5-0.
Well, now that fall camp has begun and everything, the story around Ole Miss is the fact that Lane Kiffin is taking a very NFL approach to fall camp to where they've had 3 practices in 5 days. They've had a ton of classroom time. They've had a ton of walkthroughs, but they're trying to slowly ramp up. And a lot of that, in my opinion, is those first games. When you look at it, like Furman and MTSU and Georgia Southern, and even on the road at Wake Forest, because they have the time to make that ramp. It's like you say, it's a very Ole Miss-like schedule.
I think this is the most talented Ole Miss team that the Rebels have had in the Lane Kiffin era. I mean, the transfer portal class.
In my lifetime.
It's not in your lifetime. And you've been an Ole Miss fan for how long?
My first Ole Miss game was Steve Sloan's last, which was in '82.
Folks, did you hear the speed and accuracy with which he whipped that one out? There was no hesitation. That's burned into his brain right there. That's a guy who's seen a thing or two. But I see the 5-0 start. And we've seen Lane Kiffin teams do that before, and their season will be defined by the second half of their schedule. But I have an upset on here, Steven. I think that Kentucky game, which will be the first real kind of test, Wake Forest is not anything special in the ACC. They at least have a Power 4 non-conference opponent on there, but Wake is not going to be anything special. Furman, Middle Tennessee, Georgia Southern. I think Kentucky will be a good look, but Kentucky doesn't wow me the way that Ole Miss does. But every year, teams stumble. It's usually away from home, and I'm picking an upset here. South Carolina over Ole Miss in Game 6. This is one of the 2 losses that I have on Ole Miss's schedule here in 2024. I think they are going to go to the Gamecocks and walk home with their first loss. Am I insane?
You're not insane. And I do not think that South Carolina is going to be particularly good this year. And I do think Ole Miss is probably going to be about a 10-point favorite in that game. But if you look at the schedule, you can see that the next week is the game at Tiger Stadium against LSU. And everybody is pointing to that game. South Carolina and Williams-Brice Stadium is a very difficult place to play. And we saw them against Tennessee a couple of years ago have one of those weird nights where they were to put it together at Williams-Brice. So if you had to pick an upset, that is probably one of the places that I would look for it. I do not personally think that that's going to happen, but I can see where your thought was.
The other consideration for a potential upset, and I don't think every team is going to get majorly upset throughout the course of their 2024 season. The other one I looked at was Florida, but quite frankly, I don't know. The look-ahead factor that you mentioned is a big part of the reason that I landed on that South Carolina game. But do not fear, Rebels fans. I am not here to crap on Ole Miss and say it's going to be the same old, and you're not going to run with the big kids and you can't do it. No, I think they are going into Death Valley and walking out with a win. I hope it's every bit as crazy as it was a season ago, as someone who doesn't have a specific dog in that particular fight. But I think they win at LSU. I think they come back home riding high off the win, feel like they've righted the ship. They'll be back in the top 10 after the loss to South Carolina. Then they will come back home. And I think Oklahoma's good, but I think Ole Miss is better. And I'll take the Rebels in Oxford. And those 2 wins right there, if you win both of those games, even if you have the South Carolina loss, I think Ole Miss cements themselves as a playoff team, barring a collapse down the stretch.
Yeah, 10 wins, I think, is a necessity. Now, a lot of people like to think of it's like 10 wins might not be enough from the SEC. It's like, don't listen to that. Every year, hypothetically, they can make it where a 10-win team does not make it in, but that's not the way this works. If Ole Miss wins 10 in the regular season, they're going to the playoff.
I think so as well. Here's the caveat. What if they win 10? And, in my schedule predictions, I'm not lining up the tiebreakers here because it can get wonky and weird and whatnot now that there are no divisions and such. What if they go to the SEC championship game and lose? What if they're sitting there at 10-3? Kind of a conundrum for the playoff committee, isn't it, Steven?
The first time that a team goes into the SEC championship game with the idea that they're going to the to the playoffs and they lose and they don't make the playoffs is the last year that we have the championship game.
I think that is put exceptionally well because I tend to agree. And if you look at the SEC championship games over the years, it tends to be a matchup of one loss or undefeated teams. And I've said for a long time on this show that I think the SEC championship game matchup is going to have one loss or undefeated teams in it. So the loser is a de facto auto bid into the playoff. Because if you're an 11-2 SEC team, you're in. It was just food for thought. I think your point is very well taken. So LSU Oklahoma, I like the wins at Arkansas. I don't see a stumble there. I think Sam Pittman has a less than 50% chance of being the head coach of the Razorbacks in 2025, and that's just the way that things have gone. He's had a nice run, but I think it's going to come to a head this year, and I don't anticipate Ole Miss stumbling there. Then they come back home for, it's got to be one of the biggest games in Oxford in the last decade, Steven. You're going to have probably top-ranked Georgia coming in. The point spread's going to be under 5. It's going to be in favor of the Dogs. Last I looked, it was 4.5, 5.5 in that sort of range. I think it'll be less than that once LSU and Oklahoma both succumb to the prowess of Ole Miss. But I do think Georgia goes into Oxford and walks out a winner. I think, hot take here, Steven, I'm bullish on Georgia.
Yeah, it's the best roster in college football. Everybody else is playing college football, and they basically have a UFL roster with the talent that Georgia has at the moment. And there's no shame in losing that game, but Ole Miss can win it.
Yep.
But the stars are going to have to align for that to happen.
They absolutely will. But that's the last loss of the season until they get to the playoff and we see what the matchups are. At Florida, hosting Mississippi State, I think you've got a mismatch there in the coaching sense. I think you've got a mismatch in the roster sense. I don't anticipate those being problematic games for Ole Miss. So that's how I land on the Rebels ending the season 10-2 and into the college football playoff.
Yeah, 10-2, they would probably be on that close to that 8-9 line, depending on, that early South Carolina loss, and then you lost to Georgia. So maybe you've put yourself in a position to potentially host, depending on where you sit. If Ole Miss hosted a playoff game, that would be the biggest football game in the state of Mississippi history. There would be 300,000 people in Oxford for that game. And picture Ole Miss against Notre Dame, Ole Miss versus a Michigan team, Ole Miss versus Penn State, a rematch of last year's Peach Bowl. I just think that could be nuts. It'd be
how about this one? How about Ole Miss and Oregon, and that way we can go down and hang out in the Grove together. How about that? Does that sound like a good time?
Yeah, that would be absolutely fantastic. And Puddles the Duck could make an appearance in Oxford.
yeah, the duck would be down there. Do you guys have any waterways where the giant inflatable duck could go?
Sardis Reservoir is down, 15 miles.
Perfect. Yeah, that'll do. We can get they can set up a Photoshop
or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's speak that into existence. Steven Willis. So you have Ole Miss. You have Ole Miss 11-1. Just to clarify, yes.
Yes, 11-1. Ole Miss is going to be favored likely at kickoff in 11 of the 12 games. So if it goes chalk, that would be how they would end up. And I don't see any reason to think that it won't go chalk because Lane Kiffin usually wins games he's supposed to win.
No, that's why they play the games, as they say. Steven Willis, locked on Ole Miss. Fantastic stuff. We both like Ole Miss winning at least 10 games. If you can still get their win total at 9.5 over at FanDuel, bet that over. Steven, appreciate it as always.
Appreciate it, Spencer.